An avoidant doesn't return because they're lonely. They return because something stopped working without you. Avoidants are not wired to process loss through longing the way anxious partners do. They don't sit in emotional collapse, replaying conversations, rereading messages, or romanticizing what was lost. Their system is trained to do the opposite. When separation happens, their first response is relief. Distance feels like oxygen. Silence feels like control. Distraction feels like stability. They tell themselves they're fine, that moving on is easy, that the relationship simply ran its course. And for a while, that story works. They stay busy. They detach. They keep emotions in motion instead of letting them land. From the outside, it looks like indifference. From the inside, it's suppression, doing its job exactly as it was designed to. But avoidance is not healing. It's a short-term regulation strategy. It works only as long as the nervous system believes distance equals safety. At some point, quietly, unexpectedly, that equation breaks down. The distractions stop distracting. The busyness stops calming. The silence that once felt peaceful starts to feel heavy. Not sad in a dramatic way, just unsettled, restless, off. The avoidant doesn't think, I miss them. That would require emotional vulnerability. Instead, they feel dysregulated without knowing why. Sleep changes, focus drifts, irritation increases. They feel agitated in their own life, even if nothing on the surface is wrong. This is the moment avoidance fails, when the nervous system realizes the strategy that kept them safe no longer works. What brings them back isn't nostalgia, it's not regret. In the romantic sense, it's the collapse of emotional numbing. Distance no longer provides relief. The internal quiet they expected never fully arrived. The mind goes back, not because it wants connection, but because it's searching for regulation. Your presence, once experienced as overwhelming, is now remembered as stabilizing, not exciting, not intoxicating, regulating. That's why the urge to reach out often feels sudden and confusing, even to them. They don't frame it as desire, they frame it as curiosity, checking in, coincidence, or just seeing how you're doing. The truth is simpler and harder. Their system remembers that something functioned better when you were there. This is why chasing never works with avoidance. As long as you are available, reaching, waiting, hoping, their nervous system stays regulated without having to confront loss. Your presence, even from a distance, continues to do the work. They don't feel the absence fully because you haven't fully left. But when you stop engaging emotionally, when you detach without anger, without explanation, without dramatics, the system finally has to process what it avoided. And that's when the return impulse forms, not as love, as destabilization. This isn't romance, it's regulation failure. The avoidant doesn't come back because they finally understand how special you were. They come back because the emotional bypass they relied on stopped functioning. Their independence no longer feels grounding. Their detachment no longer feels powerful. And the absence they thought they could manage now lives inside their body, not just in memory. By the time they reach out, it's often not because they want the relationship back. It's because they want the discomfort to stop. And the painful irony is this: the moment they feel pulled back is usually the moment you're no longer emotionally available in the same way. Because while they were numbing, you were actually processing, and regulation that is delayed always arrives too late. The moment you stop reaching out is the moment their control collapses. Avoidants do not regulate closeness through connection. They regulate it through control. As long as they believe they can access you, return to you, or re-engage on their terms, their nervous system stays calm. Even if they never text, even if they never show up, even if they act distant, the option itself is what soothes them. Knowing you're still emotionally available, still open, still hoping, still responsive, functions as a psychological safety net. They don't need to be present to feel secure. They just need to know they could be. That illusion of control allows them to detach without consequence, to leave without fully leaving, to avoid without actually losing anything. This is why avoidants often seem unbothered after separation, not because they don't care, but because nothing has truly changed yet. The emotional structure is still intact. You're still there in energy, even if not in proximity, still watching, still waiting, still reachable. Their system reads that as safety. They can stay distant while remaining regulated because the door hasn't closed. It's just quiet, and quiet feels manageable to them. Silence feels safer than confrontation. Distance feels safer than finality. But something shifts the moment your absence becomes real, not announced, not explained, not weaponized, just real. When you stop initiating, when you stop responding quickly, when your tone changes, when your energy no longer reaches for them. This is when the defense collapses, because now the avoidant can't control the distance anymore. The distance controls them. The separation stops being a choice and starts being a condition. And that is what their nervous system cannot tolerate. Some avoidants don't fear abandonment the way anxious partners do. They fear irreversibility. They fear not having an exit strategy back to regulation. When you disappear calmly without anger or desperation, you remove their ability to re-enter on command. The power dynamic dissolves. And suddenly, they are alone with an unfamiliar sensation, unmanaged loss. No explanation to argue with, no emotion to push against, no drama to justify withdrawal, just absence. Clean, quiet, final feeling. And that kind of silence is destabilizing to someone whose safety depends on emotional control. This is why avoidants often return at the exact moment you stop caring whether they do, because your detachment forces their system to confront something. It was designed to avoid consequence, not punishment, not rejection. Consequence. The realization that connection is not permanent, that access is not guaranteed, that people do not remain emotionally available forever simply because they once were. This realization doesn't arrive as insight. It arrives as anxiety, restlessness, intrusive thoughts, and an urge to reestablish contact, not to fix things, not to repair, but to regain equilibrium. They might frame it as missing you, as thinking about you, as wondering how you are. But what they're really responding to is the loss of regulation, your presence once provided. Your absence removes the buffer that protected them from feeling the full weight of separation. And once that buffer is gone, the nervous system scrambles to restore balance. Reaching out becomes less about connection and more about relief, less about love and more about stabilizing what has come undone inside them. The paradox is this: the very thing avoidants need to feel safe, control, is what ultimately prevents them from maintaining intimacy. And the moment that control is taken away, not through force, but through your quiet withdrawal, they are forced to feel what they delayed. By then, you are no longer chasing, no longer explaining, no longer waiting. And that is why their return often feels confusing, mistimed, or hollow, because they are coming back to regain something you already learned to live without. They don't come back to be loved. They come back when they don't have to be. For an avoidant, intimacy is not experienced as safety. It is experienced as expectation. Ever increasing closeness subtly activates a fear of being evaluated, required, or eventually exposed as insufficient. Love doesn't register as warmth in their body. It registers as responsibility. The closer you get, the more they feel the unspoken pressure to show up consistently, to communicate clearly, to regulate someone else's emotions in addition to their own. Even when you never demanded these things explicitly, their nervous system assumes they will be required. So connection becomes a performance, and distance becomes relief. This is why avoidants often pull away right after moments of emotional closeness, a deep conversation, a vulnerable confession, a moment where you see them clearly. These aren't bonding experiences to an avoidant. They are activation points. Their system interprets them as thresholds they now have to maintain. Once closeness is established, they feel trapped by the expectation to sustain it. And because they don't know how to regulate intimacy internally, they regulate it externally by withdrawing. Pulling back lowers the pressure. Silence restores equilibrium. Disappearing becomes self-protection, not rejection. When you are present, hoping, asking, or waiting, even gently, the pressure remains. Even reassurance feels like demand. Even affection feels like obligation. They sense that something is expected of them emotionally, even if you never articulate it. That's why avoidants often say they feel overwhelmed without being able to explain why. It's not the relationship itself that overwhelms them. It's the perceived requirement to perform within it, to be available, to be consistent, to be emotionally legible, all things they were never taught to do safely. The return only becomes possible when that pressure disappears, when there is no emotional role waiting for them to step back into, when they no longer feel responsible for your feelings, your healing, or your hope. The absence of expectation creates a sense of safety that presence never could. This is the painful paradox of avoidant attachment. They can only approach intimacy when intimacy is no longer required, when they believe they can show up without being needed, wanted, or relied upon in any meaningful way. This is why avoidants often reappear casually. A light message, a neutral check-in, a vague thinking of you, not a declaration, not accountability, not repair, because those would immediately reintroduce the pressure they're trying to avoid. They don't come back to rebuild the relationship. They come back to test whether the emotional cost has dropped, whether you are still there, but no longer expecting anything from them, whether contact can exist without obligation. And if they sense that you've truly let go, not in anger, not in resignation, but in grounded acceptance, their system relaxes because now they are no longer performing. They are choosing, and choice feels safer than expectation. Choice allows them to engage without feeling. But the moment expectation re-enters, the moment you lean in, ask for clarity, seek reassurance, or reopen emotional conversations, the pressure returns, and with it, the impulse to retreat. What most people misunderstand is this: avoidants don't avoid love. They avoid the internal collapse that happens when love demands consistency from a system that learned survival through self-reliance. Their return is not a sign of readiness. It's a sign of lowered threat. They are drawn back to spaces where they can exist without being seen too closely, needed too deeply, or asked to stay. And by the time you realize this, you often understand why their return no longer feels like victory. Because connection without pressure may feel safe to them, but it no longer feels fulfilling to you. Distance doesn't kill feelings for avoidance, it makes them manageable. For an avoidant, emotions are not dangerous because they are painful. They are dangerous because they are activating. Feeling deeply in real time overwhelms their nervous system, not because the feeling is wrong, but because they were never taught how to stay present inside emotional intensity. In closeness, feelings arrive all at once, layered, urgent, embodied. They demand response. They demand openness. They demand vulnerability in the now, and that immediacy is what an avoidant cannot tolerate. So they retreat, not to erase the feeling, but to survive it. Time changes the emotional landscape in a way that feels safer to them. With distance, feelings become abstract. Memory replaces immediacy. The body is no longer flooded. The mind takes over. They can think about you without having to feel you. They can miss you without having to act. They can remember moments without having to engage with the emotional consequences. Those moments carried. This is why avoidants often appear more reflective, more sentimental, or even more affectionate. Long after the connection has ended, the danger has passed. The intensity has cooled, and now emotion can exist without threat. In presence, emotion requires reciprocity. If you're here, they have to respond. If you're vulnerable, they have to hold it. If you're open, they have to stay. That's too much. But in absence, none of that is required. Distance removes responsibility. Time removes urgency. Feeling becomes something they can visit instead of something that lives inside them. And that is precisely why distance doesn't push avoidance away emotionally. It gives them the space to feel without collapsing. This delayed emotional access is deeply confusing to partners who process feelings in real time. You felt everything while it was happening. You tried to talk, repair, connect. You reached for clarity and closeness when it mattered, and they shut down. Then later, when you were no longer there, they suddenly seem to get it. They express regret. They acknowledge the connection. They speak with a softness that was absent when you needed it most. It feels unfair because it is, but it's also predictable. Avoidance feels safest processing emotions when there is no risk of immediate intimacy. This is also why they often return after long gaps, not days or weeks, but months. By then, the emotional charge has settled enough for their system to tolerate reflection. They don't remember the conflict as intensely as you do. They remember the regulation, the calm, the way being with you stabilized parts of them they didn't understand at the time. But now, from a distance, they can romanticize what they once resisted because memory doesn't demand presence. What they don't realize is that time doesn't just make feelings safer for them, it changes you. While they were slowly allowing emotion back in, you were moving through it, processing it, integrating it, rebuilding your sense of self without them. So when they return with softened feelings and delayed insight, they're often met with a version of you who no longer needs the understanding they finally found. Their timing is regulated for them, not for the relationship. The final cruelty of avoidant timing is this: the moment they can feel safely is the moment connection is no longer available, because safety arrived through distance, not through growth, and distance has consequence. By the time feelings feel manageable to them, they have already taught you how to live without their presence. And that lesson, once learned, doesn't unlearn easily. The most dangerous thing you can do to an avoidant is move on quietly. Avoidants thrive in dynamics where emotional pursuit is predictable. When someone waits, hopes, or subtly signals attachment, it maintains a framework in which avoidance feels safe. Your energy, your patience, your willingness to be available functions as a stabilizing force for them, whether they consciously realize it or not. It reassures them that even if they step back, there is still a steady presence ready to receive them. The paradox of avoidant attachment is that your care can prevent them from truly feeling the consequences of absence. They don't resist you because they don't want you. They resist you because your presence removes the full impact of their own detachment. But when you let go, truly let go, everything shifts. Moving on quietly, without drama, without ultimatums, without emotional justification, removes the safety net. Now, the absence is no longer abstract, it is real, palpable, undeniable. No longer can they rely on your energy to regulate their own nervous system. No longer can they return at will without risk of encountering a self that has moved beyond them. And that is terrifying to someone whose attachment style depends on predictability, because for the first time, avoidance doesn't bring relief, it brings instability. Their system, once soothed by your waiting, now feels disoriented. Anxiety creeps in, thoughts linger, memories no longer fade into background noise, and suddenly the very person they had been running from becomes the only one who can stabilize what they themselves cannot. This is why avoidants often reappear when you stop caring about whether they do. Not because they've changed, not because they realized your value, but because their coping mechanism has reached its limit. Your absence removes the illusion that they are in control. It confronts them with a truth they cannot fully handle. The connection they once assumed would always be there is now conditional on their choice, on their initiative, on them actually showing up. And that confrontation triggers the pullback. Their return is less about love and more about regulating a system that has gone unmoored in your absence. Avoidants don't come back for closure. They come back for the nervous system relief that presence once guaranteed. And that is why timing is everything. If you are still hoping, still chasing, still waiting, they never feel the need to return. There is no urgency in absence. Your energy continues to buffer them. But the moment you stop engaging, stop signaling, stop hoping, the vacuum appears. That vacuum is disorienting. It activates the very attachment they've been trying to avoid. And in that moment of destabilization, they reach out, often cautiously, sometimes subtly, rarely fully vulnerable. It's not a declaration of readiness. It's a test, a soft probe, a way to see if the world outside their avoidance is safe enough to interact with again. The brilliance and cruelty of this pattern is that avoidants only return when the balance has shifted in a way that benefits them. They cannot tolerate real-time emotional intensity, but they can tolerate curiosity, observation, and distance-driven. By stepping back and moving on quietly, you force a recalibration. You create a space where avoidance is no longer a protective strategy, but a liability. And that is when they circle back, not because you demanded it, not because you waited, not because you proved your worth, but because your absence finally disrupted the system they relied on to avoid their own feelings. In essence, the avoidance return is a direct reflection of your detachment. The moment you stop waiting, stop hoping, stop chasing, is the moment they feel compelled to check back. And that return, while often confusing and imperfect, is revealing. It exposes the truth about why they were ever capable of leaving in the first place, and why absence, not attention, ultimately calls them home. They don't miss the relationship, they miss the version of themselves they lost. When an avoidant returns, it rarely reflects a longing for the connection itself. It reflects a longing for a state of being that was only possible in the presence of that connection. Avoidants often experience their relationships as mirrors of self-regulation. When they are with someone who accepts them without demanding, they relax parts of themselves they otherwise keep guarded. With you, they may have felt softer, more human, less defensive, more alive. That version of themselves was nurtured not by the relationship directly, but by the permission your presence unconsciously granted them to let down their walls. They are drawn back, not to reclaim you, but to reclaim that sense of internal ease that only existed in proximity to you. This dynamic is why avoidants rarely express return as a straightforward desire for reconciliation. Instead, they may communicate curiosity, nostalgia, or casual concern. Just thinking of you. Hope you're doing well. I wondered how you're holding up. These lines are not declarations of love. They are attempts to recapture internal equilibrium. They are attempts to access the parts of themselves that felt regulated, competent, and alive when you were there. The irony is that those parts of you that were once attuned to their avoidance have likely moved on emotionally, grown stronger, and are no longer available to soothe them in the same way. What they are chasing is not a person, but a state that once existed in the relationship. And that state, now absent, forces reflection and often subtle return behavior. Avoidants are not immune to their own psychology. They can sense that the intensity of feeling they once avoided is returning in a safer, more abstract form. Distance and time allow the emotion to be manageable. When the raw vulnerability of closeness no longer threatens them, they can process the attachment they once ran from. They can acknowledge the version of themselves that thrived in the relationship. They can romanticize, reconstruct, and sometimes idealize the bond, not because the reality was perfect, but because the internal safety they once experienced is absent and their system craves it. This is why you often see avoidants reaching back after months or even years, not because they suddenly changed, but because their system is drawn toward the internal ease they previously experienced with you. This return is often accompanied by confusion and misalignment. You may feel seen, finally acknowledged, but the avoidant is not returning to meet your needs. They are returning to meet the needs of the self they lost in your presence. And that self is entwined with comfort, regulation, and familiarity, not necessarily love or commitment. They are seeking equilibrium, not necessarily relationship repair. That's why the timing feels off. That's why their words often carry a subtle detachment. That's why even when they return, the relationship rarely feels identical to what it once was. They are chasing a reflection of themselves, not the relationship as it exists in the present. This is also why avoidance returns can feel bittersweet. You may interpret it as hope, as a second chance, as reconciliation, but in reality, they are often trying to re-anchor themselves in a version of that existed when you were part of it. You are a vessel for regulation, not always a partner for growth. Their return exposes the subtle truth about avoidant attachment. Their engagement is rarely about mutual fulfillment. It is about self-preservation. They reappear when absence makes their internal world unmanageable, when time has made feelings tolerable, and when you are no longer performing emotional labor for them. In essence, they are not missing you. They are missing the parts of themselves that only existed when you were near, and that is both the attraction and the tragedy of avoidant return. Avoidants come back for one reason only. The strategy that kept them safe stopped working. The ultimate reason avoidants return is rarely about love, longing, or reconciliation. It's about survival. Avoidant attachment is built on a nervous system strategy. Avoidance protects them from the intensity of emotion, from perceived demands, from vulnerability that feels unsafe. Distance, detachment, distraction. All of these are tools to regulate internal chaos. For months, sometimes years, this system works. They move forward, suppress feelings, distract themselves, and maintain the illusion of emotional control. From the outside, it looks like indifference. From the inside, it's meticulous self-regulation, a defense against collapse. But no strategy lasts forever. Every system has its breaking point, and avoidant coping mechanisms are no different. When the tools they rely on to manage intimacy fail, the avoidant experiences what can only be described as internal disorientation. Not heartbreak, not grief in the way an anxious partner understands it, but a quiet, creeping imbalance. Sleep becomes irregular. Thoughts intrude unexpectedly. Tasks that once distracted them no longer fill the space. Emotional equilibrium begins to fracture. This is the signal that avoidance has failed, that the nervous system can no longer maintain the illusion of control, and that something outside themselves must be reckoned with. And the only thing that can trigger a return at this point is the presence of the person whose absence destabilized them, not in physical proximity, but in memory, an emotional imprint, in the invisible impact they once had on the avoidance regulation. Avoidants don't return because they understand the consequences of their past actions. They return because the internal system that once relied on avoidance has collapsed under its own limitations. It is a mechanical, biological impulse rather than a romantic one. Their return is often hesitant, cautious, and strategic. They might check in lightly, test the waters, or reconnect in ways that feel safe and non-demanding. They are not coming back to repair, to commit, or to engage fully. They are coming back to stabilize a system that has failed them internally. This is why avoidance timing often feels confusing, out of sync, or even cruel. By the time they are ready, your emotional world has shifted. You have processed, grown, and moved on in ways that leave little room for them to step back into. It's important to understand that the why behind an avoidance return is entirely self-centered in nature, not in a malicious way, but in a way dictated by survival mechanisms. Avoidants are creatures of regulation, not of relational continuity. They come back not because they want connection, but because they need it to feel safe than themselves. If you were to attempt to rebuild the relationship at this stage, the dynamic would be inherently imbalanced. They are returning to restore internal calm, not to rebuild mutual understanding. Their presence is a mirror of what they need internally, not a gift they are offering externally. This truth is both liberating and sobering. It explains the pattern with clinical clarity. Avoidants leave to protect themselves and return only when that protection fails. Nothing you did or didn't do dictates this process. Chasing, waiting, pleading, or reasoning never accelerated it. Detachment, calm, and grounded self-possession do. Their return is a reflection of absence, of disrupted equilibrium, of your ability to exist fully without them. And that is the ultimate irony of avoidant attachment. The very moment you stop revolving around them, stop giving them the energy they once relied on, stop maintaining the system that made their avoidance tolerable, is the moment they feel compelled to come back. By understanding this, you reclaim clarity and power. You no longer interpret their return as proof of care or proof of love. You recognize it for what it is, a nervous system response, a strategy that has failed, and a mirror reflecting what they could not sustain without you. And that clarity allows you to respond not out of hope or fear, but out of awareness, groundedness, and emotional sovereignty. Avoidants come back not for you, but because they cannot continue without you. And that, paradoxically, is the only reason they ever return.